Welcome to the View Magazine's Rebel Justice podcast from our Someone's Daughter podcast series. Today, we bring you a profile of a photographer who shares about their work and the way that they view the world through the lens. Zula Rabikowska is a Polish photographer and videographer based between London and Krakow. Zula was born in Poland, but she grew up in the UK, and her practice is influenced by her experience in migration. In her work, she explores themes of displacement and belonging, and recently received a grant from the MEAD Fellowship, which enabled her to document contemporary gender identity in Eastern Europe. Farah Damji from The View magazine interviewed Zula. Thank you, Farah.
Zula, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to our Someone's Daughter podcasts. These are part of our podcast talking to experienced and accomplished photographers whose work was part of our Someone's Daughter exhibition. Yours wasn't, but we absolutely love your portraits and the work that you're doing, highlighting the way that women are being treated, particularly kind of diverse women with perhaps not traditional backgrounds, LGBTQA women across Eastern Europe. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your own experiences and welcome you to this portal, which is a way of opening up people's eyes through photography, through the use of portrait photography, to issues that affect women globally around oppression, violence against women, discrimination, racism, and your work just highlights that and really amplifies it. So can you just tell us a bit about how you started in photography?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a real honor, especially having listened to some of the other people that you have interviewed. So for me, photography was something it's always been part of my life, but initially for almost the first 3 decades of my life, it wasn't a formal element. I had an alternative life where I worked in finance, I taught English abroad, I worked in customer service, and photography was just this thing that I did on the side. And over a few years, I just decided that's where my heart was. And I did an MA at London College of Communication, which really helped me reorientate kind of the way I think and approach social political issues, and helped me kind of almost translate things that I'm interested in and important stories that I want to tell visually. So since that time, I've been working as a photographer commercially, but also working on my own documentary practice. So it's been a difficult path, but one which I know where my heart is. So this is where I am now, and most of my work explores topics of migration, home, belonging, and also gender identity. As a queer photographer and an immigrant myself, I moved to the UK actually without speaking any English when I was 10. With my mum and my sister. It's something that I explore in my work and kind of influences all the projects that I have made to date so far.
Well, that's incredible. Your English is just perfect. So you actually started teaching English, you said.
Yeah.
Right. That must have been interesting, that kind of being in that intersection of people. Do you think that your experiences as a migrant affect the way that you approach your art? Not being typically English, not being typically British, has affected your gaze, the way that you approach the work that you choose, and also how you perform your photography?
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't only say that it influences it, but it's one of the main topics that I explore. So I think when I was a young kid or as a teenager, I was 10 years old and my sister was 6. We were kind of, very much sharing this path. This was before Poland was part of the EU. People didn't know where Poland was, and we were really embarrassed to be foreign, to be the other, to use our Polish names, to speak Polish even. So it was something that we tried to keep hidden. And I think over time, especially in my mid-late 20s, I kind of came to accept who I am and made it, I don't like the word pride or to be proud, but something that I really made into a strength and as a source of inspiration. I do think I always occupied this space of in between, being in between cultures, in between languages, in between countries. Everyone apart from my mum and my sister, they're all still in Poland, So when I go back to Poland, I'm not fully Polish, but when I'm in the UK, I'm not fully British or English, if you like. So yeah, very much I think having that gaze of in-betweenness is something not only that influences my work, but also drives me forward and makes me curious and makes me want to ask questions.
That's so interesting. That there is always something really fascinating about seeing pictures not taken by sort of your mainstream, well, whatever nationality. When someone comes into a country, you see it. I mean, my experience as an immigrant, I think we see things with different eyes, don't we? Your recent work is documenting women in Eastern Europe. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how it started, and also kind of what drew you, to that, and some of the issues that some of these women are facing?
So my most recent project, which I finished at the end of 2021, is called Nothing But a Curtain, and it's about womanhood, femininity, but more importantly about gender identity in post-communist countries, so Central and Eastern Europe. So as part of this work, I interviewed and photographed 104 different people. There were mainly women, but also gender fluid, non-binary, and transgender people. And the kind of motivation between that work was just to understand how communism is shaping identity, is shaping gender. And this kind of stemmed from me, my personal day-to-day questions, feeling that somehow I'm a little bit different, but a little bit the same to my peers in the UK, having stories from my grandparents, my mom, my parents really influenced me as a child, and the way that I guess I work. And I noticed that these stories was not something that my English or British counterparts easily understood. They were like, wow, what are you talking about? Food rations and people being shot in your front garden. So I just wanted to understand if it's just something that's mine or whether there are other people in those countries that did experience this regime, whether it's something that we can share. So the project was kind of fueled by me spending a lot of time researching and reading and really learning about this history in a formal way. So I've always been fascinated about borders, by these frontiers between different political states. I mean, one of my previous projects before this is called The Borderline, and it's actually about the village where I'm from, which in the 1940s had a border running through it, even though it's a village of 200 people. It was the division between the Nazi Germany and the German occupied territory. And obviously that border, then was irrelevant. So I'm always really interested in these borders and how they kind of appear and disappear and formalize, and sort of the movement of people between these borders and what it means. So I started to really educate myself more. I mean, obviously I was aware of this, but kind of what it meant, and on the logistics about the Iron Curtain. So the formal but also political and physical barrier that existed during the Cold War between the so-called East and so-called West. So during this project, I actually traveled along that border from the top of Baltic Eastern Europe, so from the top of Estonia on the border with Russia, all the way through the 10 countries. So, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, through to Romania and Bulgaria. So I went to 21 different places, 10 different countries to interview and photograph these women and just non-binary and transgender people, just to understand, what are the differences? What are the similarities? What are the obstacles? And it was a real whirlwind. I really wanted to kind of challenge stereotypes often associated with Eastern Europe. I'm really fed up seeing Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in English-speaking media, depicted as dirty and cold and backwards, and people wearing those, hats made out of bears. And obviously this reality does exist, and I even have a hat like that myself, but I just think it's so much more complex, and these realities are so diverse. I wanted to show that actually there's not this Catholic homogeneous white mass that often people think when they think about those regions, and also the desperation of those countries of not wanting to be Eastern Europe, which is something that emerged, as I was traveling.
If you can highlight a couple of the case studies that really, like a couple of the women that you photographed that really stood out. I know transgender people have a really hard time there. I mean, they're banned basically, aren't they? It's just ridiculous. Or they're denied that they exist or something like that.
Yeah, no problem. So, I mean, generally LGBTQ rights in these regions are really tense. And for example, in Poland, a few years ago, they introduced something LGBT free zones. So this was a scheme supported by the church and officially, unofficially by the Polish government and other institutions, where people are giving out stickers that said LGBT free, which is absolutely horrendous. And I mean, it wasn't in big cities like Warsaw, Krakow, or anything like that. But the fact that they still existed is illegal, is homophobic. So actually, Poland has been taken to court by the Human Rights Court, and it's an ongoing case, and they're facing a lot of backlash from the EU, rightly so. But that reality that does exist. To kind of elaborate on that further, particularly the more south I went during this project, so in Romania and Bulgaria, really interesting cases, because I felt like in Bulgaria people were not as open and free to speak with me, even though they did. In every place I went to, I was able to find participants. But in Bulgaria, I just felt the more south I went, this kind of binary division between what it's meant to, what is a man, what is a woman, is very well defined. And you could see that reflected in the way people dressed and behaved. And the queer people that I did interview had some horrific stories, from things like, oh, I'm scared to hold my girlfriend's hand in public because I will either be attacked or assaulted or have really indecent propositions from random, predominantly men in public. So these are kind of day in, day out examples. Things that also came up quite a lot was hair and body image. So I spoke to a lot of women, maybe not a significant number of women who had short hair, particularly buzz cuts, and hair is something that is really important in gender expression and gender identity. And the individuals that I did speak, for example, in Bulgaria, I spoke to these two great non-binary people, have highlighted to me that since they cut their hair, they just received so much more backlash from their parents, from their families, but also leading to, for example, arrest, protests. So they gave me loads of examples when they were protesting. Can't remember what this particular protest was, but they would always be targeted out by police because of the way they looked, which is something, I kind of am living in London right now, but I did move back to Poland. It's something that I don't even think about in the same way that if I had short hair that I could face. So these are the stories that stood out. And I mean, in terms of transgender people, this is like a whole other kettle of worms, and how difficult it is. For example, in Romania, doesn't allow you to legally change your gender the way that it's written in your passport or ID documents. It's a really difficult process, and it varies from country to country. So it's not the same in every single country. And I am not an expert on the law and how it could have changed since last year. For example, in Slovakia, I was able to interview, I think, one of the youngest transgender people. He was 18 when we met, and explained the journey to me and how he went, from a really quite early age, but had the backing of his mum and of his family. And his mum is an important person in Slovakia, in kind of like the art activism world, which was really helpful. But even now, he decided to live in Prague. And of all these places that I visited, Prague is one of these, I guess, havens. And generally, Czech Republic seemed very chilled and free in comparison to other places. I mean, my own experience is kind of a female body. I'm quite small. I'm 5'3". I look quite young. Was quite interesting. When I started, I did this project on my own. I was traveling by public transport. People went up to me, predominantly men, went up to me all the time asking, who are you waiting for? Why are you on your own? Where's your husband? I was eating out on my own, which I think is normal. I was going to have beer on my own, and people would constantly be like, oh, who are you waiting for? Where are you going? Not to mention taxi drivers who were very interested why I'm traveling on my own. And I said, I'm traveling for work. And they're like, oh, on your own? Well, you don't bring your mum or your partner or your friends to work. Why would I bring them with me? And yeah, that made me feel really, really, really frustrated. And I was thinking, my body image. I mean, I called my mum up and I was like, I'm shaving my hair. I don't want to be perceived as this, like female body moving through space. So I think also the way I've been thinking about myself and in relation to these environments was very different. And when I came back to London after having finished that, I was like, wow, like I can go out and have a beer and no one bats an eyelid in most places. Whereas like doing this project, it felt like a daily battle almost to prove myself that I'm doing it.
That is so interesting. It's, how we are perceived and how we perceive ourselves, and this sort of massive chasm between the two is always fascinating, isn't it? Can you tell me something about the organization that you started working with different women who self-define, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So it kind of came about, it's called the Red Zenith Collective, and it's an online platform for women and non-binary individuals who create work or are artists or have anything to do with Central or Eastern Europe. And that kind of started as a sub project because I was working on so much research for this, the project that I just mentioned carried out. I was making connections with individuals, organizations, researching artists. And it was May 2020, so kind of, or maybe April 2020, that pandemic, a great pandemic time after the first wave. And together with my Polish friend and curator, Marta Grabowska, who was at that time living in London, we kind of were like, wow, there's something going on here. We need to promote women and non-binary individuals, especially as women. We have both faced really a lack of support from other women, but kind of like being shot down. I mean, it's hard enough as it is. We wanted to create like a supportive and nourishing environment, but give people a chance to kind of network, mingle amongst themselves. So we set this up, Red Zenith Collective. Color red, obviously, it's got this strong connotation, like movies and a thing of being like violence, blood, romance. But obviously for us, the importance was the communist link. And the red color is something that's associated with that period. So that's why we went for red. And zenith is something, high peak in the sky, but also has links within like Slavic roots linguistically. So we decided to go with that with the name. So initially when we started, we were just sharing work of people that we thought were inspiring and inspirational. And then we launched an initiative called Red Zenith Dialogues and Red Zenith Presents. And we would invite artists from all around the world, as long as they're working related to the, Eastern Central Europe in any way, shape or form. We invited them for Instagram lives. So there was a time when we almost did it weekly. Then we introduced the Red Zenith Presents, which were pre-recorded sessions. We also had our first call out in 2020, and the theme was equality. So at that time, Poland banned abortion as well. So we were both living in Poland at the time, and we were thinking about what equality in the world means. So we had a really huge response. On top of my head, it was something like over 30 or 33 different countries. People from those countries reached out to us. It was amazing. So it took us quite a while to collate and go through all the material. And we made an online publication which responded to the theme equality in those regions, which is still available online. I can send you a link and you can include it if it's of interest. And it was artists working with variety of media, photographers, installations, sculpture, poets, writers. And right now we're focusing on promoting Ukrainian artists, whether they're still living in Ukraine or those that have escaped. And we're planning on applying for some funding and hopefully before the end of the year having like a physical, whether it's an event, a workshop or exhibition, something like that.
Where do you see Red Zenith standing? Sort of, what do you see happening with it for the future? Because it's such a great initiative, sort of bringing women together. It's sad when women don't support women, and we see that, everywhere, particularly in justice and equality, where women who should be coming forward and stepping up and championing causes sort of feel that they have to progress themselves rather than progress the collective. And it's always very sad to see, but it's such a great idea, and we need this sort of artistic solidarity, and we need to expand it. So how do you see that moving forward? What would be your big kind of dream for that?
I think so. Yeah, right now I'm in London, and Marta is in Poland, and she's very occupied and being really hands-on with cooking every day. Krakow, where she is bursting at the seams with refugees right now. So I know she's kind of really running that side of things, where I'm dealing with the platform online. So hopefully, once things come down and we're able to secure some funding, we can have some more call outs, events, and more kind of like formally structured things happening. I forgot to mention actually, our first symposium, which was held online, was about ethnicity and race and racism in Central and Eastern Europe. And we kind of hosted the event, but we invited women of color, predominantly from those regions who identify as Czech and Polish. And I think we had another nationality as well, but who are people of color. And they spoke what it's like to be Black and Polish. So that was our first event. So we're hoping to have some more of those soon. But obviously, the situation in Poland is very different to what it is in the UK. I think in the UK, we're getting the diluted reality of what's happening at the Ukrainian border right now. And actually, I'm flying out on Monday to Poland myself to document the situation there. So I think we're kind of channeling our energy into being there, kind of like hands-on practically first, and then thinking about the art and culture, and also seeing what happens with Ukrainian artists in Poland, because they're going to need platforms and support and networks. So hopefully we'll be able to do something there.
That's really inspiring to see you sort of, bringing yourself and your art into the heat of a terrible worldwide situation. There's no sense in what's happening, but it's so inspiring to see you actually going into there, weaponized with your camera and your determination. It's just brilliant. Really, really good luck with that. Is there anything else that you want to add to that? There is actually a question I wanted to ask you. Do you think a photographer's gaze, or photography in general, can change? We see a lot of photography used around social justice campaigns, and that's what Someone's Daughter is. But do you think it can actually change the narrative? Because we had a very strange backlash to Someone's Daughter, where establishment people just thought it was too powerful. There were too many powerful people attached to it, and it was obviously getting a little bit too big for our boots as an organization or something. So they came and attacked it. And the simplest way to attack it was to attack the people involved in it, which was really a shame. We've overcome that now, and obviously it's going to go on. We're presenting it at the European Parliament, at the UN, and in Photo North, and all sorts of other places. But do you think that photography in itself, as the medium, can actually propel or even implement social change, social justice?
Absolutely. That's kind of what still drives me to that hope to make work. Although I do think the whole narrative about documentary photography and photojournalism has shifted in the last decade, but particularly within the last 5 years or so. Before, it was very common for men, predominantly white cis men, just to be parachuted, to whatever war conflict is happening and just document. I'm still seeing that with the way that the current war in Ukraine is being documented. I came across a list of top 10 photographers to follow for the cover of this, and I think 9 of them were either American or British. And I was like, seriously, why can't you get Ukrainian, Polish, kind of like other people that are there locally? Why do you need to send someone from LA who I bet you doesn't speak any of those languages to document as an outsider? So I think there's a lot of frustration there, and I think rightly so, people are asking who's taken this photograph? What is the relationship between the photographer and the person on the other side of the camera? And I absolutely hate the word subjects. Often people talk about the subject, and maybe if I'm doing a commercial shoot where the power dynamic is different. But in my last project, for example, I very much treat them as participants. And I think thinking about using slightly different language and thinking about them as participants, as actively participating in the creation of this narrative is really empowering. So I think what people are striving for more in documentary photography is to create images, and something that I hope to achieve as well is to create images that are asking questions. I really disagree with this quote, like image speaks 1,000 words or whatever it is. I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can see a photo, of, and we're seeing a lot of those, especially now, of a crying woman holding a baby with blood. It doesn't it creates a visceral, instantaneous reaction. But then as an individual, are you going to go and do something about this? Are you going to go and donate or fly to Ukraine? No, the chances are you're probably not going to do that. So I think people are really rethinking what kind of images, and not just images, but combining different elements can they make to create that change, and to actually think about where does change happen. I was filming this really fantastic workshop a couple of weeks ago in London, and it was all about active change and activism. And the question was raised, where does change happen? Does it happen there in the courtroom? To an extent, yes, and legislation changes. But actually, the most powerful change is having an uncomfortable conversation about, I don't know, race or about ethnicity or about queerness with your grandparents, with your parents, with your colleagues, with your family, because that's when you can really, I think, like, battle it out. So not everyone can go and can protest and create that, but everyone has the ability to make change. And I think it is possible to do that with photos as well. I think also in relation to that question, when thinking about who is creating these images and what is, what's the narrative, what's the topic of this project, there's been a shift where people are really encouraged to tell their personal stories and think, who are you in relation to this? So one of my projects that I created when I was doing the MA in documentary photography was called Citizens of Nowhere. And that was about my experience and my mum's and my sister's of being free Polish migrants or immigrants living in London post-Brexit, and the increased xenophobia, and the attacks my mum faced, whether they're physical or verbal. And that project was the first time I worked in such a personal way and made myself so vulnerable. And it won quite a lot of awards. Loads of people connected with it. When I've had it exhibited, people who might not have been Polish at all, but they had, I don't know, a grandparent from a completely different continent. They said to me, actually, I can relate to this. So I think there is something really powerful about using the personal to create a universal message. Whereas if you just see generic photos of war, obviously it's horrendous and devastating, and it should be documented so people, know what's going on. But I don't know to what extent those kind of dramatic images that we're so desensitized to seeing, especially now, is all over social media and the news, can create the change that perhaps they hope to make.
That's so interesting. I mean, I think there's such a fine line between exploitation and art and socially aware or campaigning photography. Yeah, it's a really fine line, and I think we're seeing it crossed, an awful lot at the moment. Where there's also kind of only so much blood and violence that we can take, and I think it just, as you say, just desensitizes us completely. So when you're taking a photograph, a portrait photograph, how do you make that person feel comfortable? How do you enter their? I mean, I think the success of our someone's daughter portraits is that they really enter into people's personal spaces, and they open up a portal into how that person, whether you're a baroness or you're a former prisoner or an activist, they really represent how that person sees herself today. And I think they were so successful in the way that the photographers interacted with their sitters, and there was kind of a lot of participation in the process in a lot of them, and I think you see that in the photographs. So how do you engage your, I won't call them sitters because I don't like that, it's very passive, that term, isn't it? So how do you engage the person that you're photographing? How do you make it a participatory kind of revealing process? Because your photographs, your portraits are extremely revealing, and you really get a sense of whether it's fantasy or imagined or real, you do get a sense of the person that you photographed.
Thank you. I think it's a process, and it's not a process that I have mastered at all. But I think that also goes back to your previous question, which was about kind of the power of photography, and when I was saying who is creating, who is making that image. And I've seen a lot of, for example, male photographers, and they just photograph women, and it literally makes me sick. Because I just think, like, I think I read somewhere on some, top tips on photos, and it was like how to photograph cars, animals, women, not people, women. It's just like, what are the skills in photographing men to women being different? So I think, and obviously not all photographers are like that, but I definitely feel more comfortable going into photograph. I'm talking about documentary work here, not commercial assignments, obviously, where, it's a different story, and obviously the person being photographed, might be commissioning you and has a vested interest themselves. But in my documentary work, for example, in the 104 people I photographed, I found them by going up to people on the street, by reaching out to relevant organizations, charities, being very active on social media, and just saying, "Hi, I'm doing this project. It's about this. Can I hear your perspective? Can I hear your story? Can you tell me what it's about? How do you feel?" And, I was actually quite successful when I approached people in the street. I still find it nerve-wracking, but once I'm always very transparent what I'm doing, So with that project, I said what's going to happen to it, that's going to be exhibited, it's going to be published, it's going to be, have a life of its own so people know what they're signing up for. But I think a vital part of the process is making me as a photographer vulnerable. So I would always start each session by telling people about myself, about my life, by giving them insight, not just like professionally what I do and how I've worked, but like the obstacles I face, the difficulties, my own discrimination and problems. And I think creating that some sort of human connection where you can see where you can find a connection, I think is really, really important. And with that, then more often than not comes trust. Because if you tell something about yourself to someone, you're trusting them with that information. So then people are more likely to trust you. So when I met up with people, I always made it very clear, we're going to be there for a couple of hours and we're going to be talking. So with this particular project, I always had about an hour, 2-hour interview or conversation. Then there was different elements. I asked each of my participants for a written testimony, in their handwriting. And for this project, I was also asking for them to draw. So it's almost like their direct input into the photography that I created, and as well as their own voice, which I recorded. So it's almost like the photograph is the last thing on the at the food chain. I know a lot of photographers, for example, will have a release shutter and they will give the release shutter to the participant, so they actually are the ones that press it themselves. But I think for me, it's creating that intimacy and that vulnerability where people share stuff about this. I mean, I've had people really break down and cry and share stuff, and they would say to me, "I've never talked about this to anyone." So also in that sense, I had to be very careful to take a step out after I've had an interview and make sure I don't, I can't take on 104 people's lives. In my mind, it would cause me to explode, to have that kind of like boundaries and distance and not be too wrapped up, but also be sensitive enough to process anything. And I think maybe that's why it comes across in the photos. It's after that conversation was had and those people had shared stories and elements of their life with me.
How do you deal with the trauma? Because, you are seeing and witnessing, and especially what you're going to go into now, you're going to see an awful lot of trauma. How are you going to deal with the vicarious trauma?
So in the past, when I've worked in this project, I think it's having the sufficient time and space to process anything, but to process everything. But I've also learned not to push people, like if they don't want to share this part of their story, I'm not kind of like a journalist searching for a hot story. I'm not going to push anyone to make them feel uncomfortable. I know how to ask the right questions, so if someone wants to share something, they can, but I think for me it's having that time and space. I have attended previous funding workshops where I know other photographers, something I haven't done myself, but maybe once I go into work and have your stories, it's something for me to consider. But other people have advised, for example, to when you apply for funding, to make sure that you budget for counselling and kind of mental health practitioners to help you then navigate and distance yourself from that.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's about distancing. I think it's about managing the trauma, because you can't really, it's very hard to compartmentalize when you've heard someone's story. It's very hard to compartmentalize it in your brain. Trauma is trauma, and it attaches, whether it's happened to you or whether you've heard about it or seen it. So yeah, do explore some of that, because it's very draining, and we see it all the time in the work that we do at The View, that it's very hard to listen to these things and see these things without having any kind of release. So we have monthly sessions, supervision sessions. Whoever wants to attend, they're not mandatory, but whoever wants to attend can. And if something has come up that's painful or difficult, then they can address it in a safe space. So I think it's something that artists in general, we go in wanting to report and document and preserve, but we also have to think about kind of what that's doing to our own psyche as well, because we're only going to be effective vessels if we can kind of clean out the residue of what happened before and then sort of go into something new, fresh. Otherwise it just kind of, it deposits and deposits and deposits, and your lens kind of becomes cloudy with all these other, people's experiences and things. I mean, that's just kind of, what I've found. But it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really wonderful to be able to share these experiences with you.
Thank you so much, Zula, for sharing from your experience and the fascinating insights into a world we rarely see. Thank you for your time to speak to us. Someone's Daughter gives us a glimpse through the photographer's eyes and lenses into how they view the world and how they feel, and how photography can change the world as a tool for social justice. Thank you for listening.